In the name of the one holy and living God. Amen. Please. Good morning. That was awesome. It's so great to have you in worship with us today, and good to see you on this fifth Sunday in Epiphany. Have you ever just known that you were in the presence of God without any doubt in your mind? What was that like? What did you feel like? Who was there? What do you remember? Perhaps it overwhelmed you or knocked you down. Perhaps it left you speechless. Has God ever spoken to you? In our world these days, whenever someone tells us that God spoke to them or that they saw God or spoke with God or something like that, we are more likely to blow them off as unwell or simply keep moving along pretending like we didn't hear anything. We've been taught to understand such a claim as so impossible that someone surely needs our help. There's a lot that goes into that, it seems to me. We aren't as comfortable this day and age, living in the space within our hearts and souls that is mysterious and unexplained. Our world is more comfortable in the known, the certain, the tangible. My guess is, however, that when this service is over, I've been preaching long enough to know how this works. When this service is over, at least one person will tell me a story about a time when they knew that they had encountered the holy, the divine, God, and maybe even heard a voice speaking to them. And I would argue we will all have known in some way or some time, perhaps more than once, of a love so palpable it left us breathless, of a presence so true and real it stopped us in our tracks, of a voice so clear we couldn't ignore it. Experiences that are otherwise unexplained, except to say, surely that was God. Just as I imagine someone will tell me such a story of encounter, so too would I imagine that someone who hears this may feel as if they are not worthy of such a thing, that God hasn't shown up for them like that, so what have they done wrong? Those are big questions that probably need more than one sermon can answer. But what I read and hear in today's reading is the eternal truth echoing down through the ages once again. God has and will continue to show up in our lives, to meet us where we are, to forgive us entirely, and to love us recklessly and abundantly. God isn't keeping score about all that you've done wrong or right. God isn't keeping a record of what you've done well enough to earn this world-changing love. God's love searches for and finds you. It is promised for you despite if you think you've earned it or not. And God has called you to tell the world of the healing and hope it needs and is yet to know. That's the sermon. That's all I want you to know today. That's all I want you to know every day. So if you hear nothing else today, hear that. I'm going to keep preaching now. It's going to disappoint you. But if you hear nothing else, hear that. The sermon's not over. The three readings for today, Isaiah and 1 Corinthians and Luke, all point to this truth. They're rather incredible because they all intersect with the stories of three folks whose experience and encounter of God changed them entirely. Who encountered a relentless love that upends all human expectation, forgives and makes new, and sends us out to the world. For Isaiah, it happened in the year that King Uzziah died, a real and historical time and place. It was that year, some 2,700 years before our time, when he saw the Lord in the Holy of Holies, that central place in God's temple where one would really encounter God, it was believed. We are told that in that moment, that the foundation shook. The hem of God's robe filled the entire place. There were seraphs in attendance, angelic beings, not the hallmark blonde-haired, blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked kind. These had 6 wings, and they flew around and they spoke. What a scene. And Isaiah's response is not to be immediately comforted or feel, important. This isn't a warm and fuzzy scene here, but rather he is almost immediately aware of his lack of qualifications to be called. Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. He believes that because of who he is and who he knows and who his people are, that surely he must not be in the presence of God. Surely he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I am lost, he says. And yet God has called Isaiah. And instead of calling someone who would be a person of clean lips, who hung out the right crowd, he has called Isaiah, whom God will purify and renew and restore with a burning coal on those same lips to restore and forgive him. Coming into God's nearer presence for Isaiah did not have a prerequisite of getting his past corrected first in order to speak with God, or checking off a bunch of good behaviors to counter the bad. He presented himself as he was, a self-proclaimed man of unclean lips. And God used that person and chose that person to be God's very messenger. When Paul encountered the love of God, it quite literally knocked him to the ground. The feast day of his conversion was a couple of weeks ago, in which the church recounts that story when Saul, the one who repeatedly and violently, recklessly persecuted Christians, he saw a great light and he was knocked off his horse. This ultimately became his conversion moment, and he became known as Paul. He would go on to give his very life for the faith he once persecuted so many others for. He would be incarcerated many times over, and his writings would go on to shape the church for centuries, even millennia to come. Today he writes to remind the Corinthians of the good news of God that they have heard. And he tells us a sort of listing of everybody that this good news has come to. And last of all, he says, last of all, to one untimely born, he also appears to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. And yet God appeared to him even still. Someone who gave so much of their life to violently oppose God's good news was shown the brightest light. Someone whose past could not have disqualified him more for being an apostle was knocked down by God's love. Someone who had every reason to be forgotten and dismissed by God was precisely known and chosen and used to proclaim the faith we now share, known to the entire world over. Simon, who would later come to be called Peter, was done fishing for the day, Luke tells us. He and James and John had spent the day doing what it is that they do, and now they were cleaning up and heading home after a bad day on the water. They had to work that day. Though the crowds were trying to follow Jesus and to know more, they had to work. And even as he taught the crowds, he came to those three fishermen and said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets." In what is perhaps the church's first example of its too often used excuse, "We've tried that before," Simon says, "We've worked all night and we've caught nothing." But he relents and gets the nets back out, puts the boat out into deep water. I wonder what Simon was thinking about and feeling in that moment. If he was anything like me, and perhaps like you, he was ready to prove Jesus wrong. See, Jesus, is just more trash and another boot in the net. There's no fish. His skepticism and jadedness that came from his own known and lived experiences had caused him to be able to see what was possible. The very idea of something new, something abundant, something previously unimaginable happening, well, that idea just wasn't even conceivable, much less possible. Until the nets started to tighten and creak and crack, until the boats started to sink and they needed help because the fish were so many. This is the apostle who will go on to be called the rock of the church, the one who will go on to deny Jesus in his last days, the one who will help establish the church just after Jesus' death, a mixed bag to be sure. And all of that started with a good deal of doubt, even more skepticism, and a pretty certain belief that the impossible could never be possible. But Jesus climbed aboard his boat anyway and showed him another way. Isaiah and Paul and Simon, each with a resume and qualifications to put them on the outside, meet God in our stories for today in direct and real and transformative ways. Each of these encounters the living and true love of God when they didn't think it's possible. Each of these who did not think they had earned such an encounter, who didn't believe such an encounter would ever come, or who didn't believe such an encounter would ever change things. Each of these came to know that eternal truth that is promised for you on this day. I will repeat what I said earlier so you can definitely remember it. God's love searches for you and finds you. It is promised for you despite if you think you've earned it or not. And God has called you to tell the world of a healing and hope it needs and is yet to know. And that's just the thing. Each time someone in Scripture or someone we know or even us encounters God in ways big or small, they can't help but be changed. But that almost isn't enough. I mean, it is. But the example that Isaiah and Paul and Simon hold out for us, and the call God places on our lives, is to not let that transformation be ours alone. When Isaiah is sent forth from his encounter with God, God tells him that he has to go back to his people, to go back to the people beset by chaos and despair everywhere, politically, socially, economically, everywhere in their community. Isaiah is to go to them and to tell them that though there is vast emptiness in the midst of the land, as the text says, though the land seems uninhabitable, and though the trees have been reduced to stumps, go to them and say this, God says. Say this. The holy seed is the stump. That which the world has cast aside, that which the world has called forgotten, that which is a sign of death and ruin, from that very place life will come. It is that very place that shows us what is possible. It is that very place that shows us that God will move in our world and what God is up to, bringing forth life from death, hope from despair, joy from suffering, grace and mercy from brokenness. My friends, you are loved immeasurably. God's love does seek you even as you seek it, and it is promised for you in ways unimaginable. And when you encounter this love, as you have and as you will, let it change you that you might change the world. Let it send you forth to every stump, every seemingly dead and forgotten place, and say, God is making a way here. God is doing something new here. This is a seed of love and hope and grace abundant. Let our encounters of God's love change us, renew us, remake us, that we might be led to join God in planting seeds of new life to grow all over this world.